It's good to be here at Florida State University, I'll tell you that. I've been so warmly received. I feel important. I don't know if that's justified or not, but I feel like my work has not fallen on deaf ears the way I've been received here, and I appreciate that. But let me share my remarks. It's a privilege to be with you here today. I want to talk about something that has preoccupied me for more than 30 years. Self-censorship. Not censorship by the state, not suppression by some external authority, rather, the subtle, pervasive, invisible process by which we constrain our own expression, our own intellectual curiosity, our own moral imagination. This is not a lecture about free speech. It's a lecture about the fact that no act of speaking can ever be entirely free of its social consequences. I wrote about this subject in an essay I published in the journal Rationality and Society way back in 1994. That piece was reprinted recently in a short book that I see in people's hands around this room from Polity Press. And I've returned to this theme time and again on my podcast, in the classroom, in essays, and in conversations with friends and critics alike, because I believe self-censorship is the defining pathology of our intellectual culture today. So let me do three things. First, explain my theory of self-censorship, what I meant in that early essay and how I understand it now. Second, apply that theory to the way Americans talk or fail to talk about race and inequality. Third, extend the same analytical lens to our global moment, especially to the deeply conflicted conversation about Israel, Gaza, and the moral responsibilities of a democratic society at war. My aim here is not merely to defend free speech or exhort you to speak your minds. That's too easy. My aim is to help you see the moral and social dynamics that are at work, the incentives, the reputational pressures, the identity commitments that shape how we think and talk long before a word ever leaves our mouths. Let me begin with the theory. In my early essay, I argued that self-censorship is rational. It arises naturally in communities where people value their standing, where respectability, belonging, and moral legitimacy become scarce goods. Social life is not just about material resources or formal rules. It's also about symbolic currency, honor, dignity, identity, membership. People behave strategically in these environments. They trim their sails to the prevailing winds. But that original essay also stressed something else. Social life is plural. We address not one audience, but many. We speak simultaneously to peers, to critics, to allies, to employers, to strangers on the internet, to members of our own ethnic and religious group. These audiences do not share the same expectations. What earns applause from one may provoke condemnation from another. The speaker becomes an acrobat balancing on a tightrope stretched between incompatible constituencies. And once you acknowledge these multiple audiences, you begin to see why the temptation toward imprecision becomes so powerful. Ambiguity is adaptive. Hedging is rational. Vagueness provides plausible deniability, a way to speak without fully committing, a way to hint in one direction while protecting oneself from the backlash of another. We do this in two ways: by withholding opinions we fear may be discrediting, and by affirming opinions we believe are socially rewarded, even if we are not wholly convinced. This isn't cowardice, it's human nature. It's how reputational economies work. There's another wrinkle I wrote back in 1994, how signaling works when saying the wrong thing carries real social costs. If speaking out risks ostracism, then the only people willing to do so will often be those who care least about the audience's approval. But that very lack of concern can itself be a troubling signal. It may suggest not courage or clarity, but genuine indifference to others' moral judgments, or even an adherence to views we rightly find objectionable. So a vicious cycle can form. Controversial arguments become associated with the least sympathetic messengers, and reasonable people who might explore those ideas in good faith stay silent rather than be mistaken for them. This dynamic deepens stigma and narrows the space for honest conversation. And yet, this subtle mechanism has profound consequences. It creates what I call a discursive equilibrium, a pattern of public speech that does not necessarily reflect what people privately believe, but reflects instead what they feel safe professing. Here is the crucial insight. Self-censorship warps the public sphere not because people are forced into silence, but because they anticipate disapproval. They make second-order judgments. What will others think of me if they learn that I think this way? But just as important is the multiplicity of these others. The challenge is not simply that someone might disapprove, it's that different people will disapprove for different reasons. You fear offending. You fear offending colleagues while also fearing disappointing your family. You fear alienating your political allies while also fearing being misunderstood by your students. You sculpt a sentence knowing it will land in several moral universes at once. Once this anticipatory restraint becomes widespread, the entire ecology of discourse shifts. Certain questions can no longer be asked. Certain hypotheses can no longer be entertained. Certain facts can no longer be introduced into argument. A tacit orthodoxy emerges, not through coercion, but through coordination. You get a kind of speech cartel, implicit price fixing in the marketplace of ideas. Everyone is saying the same thing, not because they all believe it, but because that's the safe equilibrium. This is the most durable form of unfreedom because you don't need a censor when people censor themselves. Let me talk now about self-censorship in the American conversation on race. Nowhere is this phenomenon more evident today than in the realm of race conversation. We inhabit a discursive environment where certain propositions, whether true or not, are deemed morally untouchable. I don't mean hateful speech. I'm talking about empirical questions, analytical frameworks, lines of inquiry that might complicate the narrative of systemic oppression. Let me be concrete. It has become extraordinarily difficult to discuss racial disparities, whether in academic environments, crime, household structure, income, or wealth. It's become difficult to discuss these matters without genuflecting to a set of prescribed explanations. To deviate is to risk being labeled insensitive, retrograde, or worse, a traitor to one's own people. And here, the multiple audiences problem is acute. As a Black public intellectual, I speak not only to the general public, but also to Black Americans who may feel deeply invested in narratives of historical injustice, to white liberals who feel morally responsible for rectifying that injustice, to conservative policymakers who prioritize agency and incentives over structural explanations, to academics who insist on methodological rigor, to activists who demand ideological loyalty. Each audience brings its own moral ledger and its own emotional terrain. To satisfy one is to court conflict with another. This fractured audience structure encourages strategic ambiguity. It pressures people to speak in a register that is just vague enough to placate everyone. Thus, we adopt euphemisms. We cloak uncomfortable truths in sociological jargon. We gesture toward complexity, not to illuminate, but to obscure. We leave ourselves escape hatches so that when pressed, we can say, that's not what I meant. This is not an abstract concern for me. I've lived this. I've been praised and condemned, sometimes in the same week, by those who believe I have departed from the script of respectable Black intelligentsia. I've been told that my race obliges me to affirm certain conclusions. I've also been chastised for betraying conservative orthodoxy, even when I'm only acknowledging structural forces that shape opportunity. This is the tyranny of orthodoxy. Not that it silences everyone equally, but that it compels people to speak in ways that affirm their group identity, even when the underlying reality is more complex. Discussions of police violence become narrow morality tales. Debates about affirmative action become boundary markers for tribal loyalties. Conversations about inequality turn into battles over whose narrative, oppression, or agency will dominate. But here's the truth. We cannot understand racial inequality, I should say. We cannot understand racial inequality if we refuse to consider all possible causal mechanisms. Culture, incentives, history, norms, policy, family, markets, behavior, discrimination. All of these matter. None should be considered off limits. And let me underscore something here. Genuine moral argument must begin with the world as it actually is, not with the world as we wish existed or the one our expressive norms permit us to acknowledge. Yet the conventions of self-censorship often push us toward a kind of symbolic morality, a performative morality, performance of concern that avoids uncomfortable facts. In that environment, social conformity masquerades as moral clarity, and the appearance of righteousness crowds out the harder work of ethical reflection. When we allow ourselves to be governed by what is safe to say rather than what is true, we end up with a morality that is sentimental rather than serious. Furthermore, in the context of discussing racial disparities, because different audiences interpret different explanations as moral betrayal, a person may resort to imprecise formulations that gesture toward multiple viewpoints without fully endorsing any one of them. The professional speaks in a kind of coded language. These issues are complicated. There are structural forces. We must acknowledge lived experience. We have to center marginalized voices. Speaking in this way signals moral alignment without committing to any concrete empirical claim or analytical position. This is not morally serious. Such phrases carry just enough semantic weight to pass muster in diverse circles while avoiding the perils of specificity. When dissenting voices are stigmatized, public discourse becomes unmoored from political reality. I should say from empirical reality. And when reality eventually intrudes, as it must, trust in institutions erodes. People feel manipulated. They seek more radical alternatives. They descend into online echo chambers where self-censorship is replaced by reckless performative transgression. Evidently, we have lost the ability to reason together. A healthier conversation about racial disparities would begin by acknowledging that no single narrative can capture the full truth of American inequality. It would allow us to confront uncomfortable facts about history, yes, but also about culture, about institutions, yes, but also about personal behavior. without treating any one fact as a moral verdict on an entire people. It would permit us to say without fear that systemic variants have shaped life chances for generations and that individual choices and community norms matter profoundly as well. It would welcome empirical inquiry rather than treating data as a weapon. In such a conversation, disagreement over causes would not be mistaken for indifference to suffering, and calls for personal responsibility would not be read as denials of injustice. We could talk honestly about education, crime, family structure, and economic opportunity because we had first made room to see one another as citizens engaged in a common project rather than as combatants in a moral drama. Only then could we imagine reforms, legal, cultural, economic, that honor both the dignity of individuals and the obligations of the society they inhabit. Let me talk now about self-censorship, identity, and the Israel-Gaza debate. This same pathology now afflicts our public conversations about Israel and Gaza. It's a mirror case, though the fault lines are, of course, very different. Here, too, positions have become identity badges. Here, too, students and faculty feel pressure to voice solidarity statements that they don't fully understand. Here, too, people fear that expressing nuance will trigger moral condemnation from the left, the right, or their own communities. The discourse is patrolled. On one side, criticism of Israeli policy is read as hostility to Jewish identity. On the other, moral condemnation of Hamas is taken as complicity in genocide, quote unquote. People perform outrage. They issue statements as ritual acts. They participate in a kind of moral theater. But beneath this moral theater lies the same structural reality I diagnosed in 1994, namely, speakers face multiple mutually suspicious audiences. A professor who criticizes Israeli military action worries about alienating Jewish colleagues or donors. The same professor, if too forceful in condemning Hamas, worries about alienating Muslim students or progressive activists. A student organizer fears that a single poorly phrased sentence, one that omits some required gesture of solidarity or fails to affirm the right identity markers, will follow them for years. Journalists write under the gaze of readers who interpret their every word as a test of tribal loyalty. And the politician is caught in a similar bind. A word of sympathy for Palestinians may anger pro-Israeli constituents and donors, while an emphatic defense of Israel can provoke a backlash from progressive voters or immigrant communities. Every sentence must be calibrated to avoid triggering one faction without alienating another, leaving the politician speaking in carefully balanced platitudes rather than forthright conviction. And once again, ambiguity becomes a rational strategy. People deploy imprecision as a shield. They choose broad, emotionally resonant language, decolonization, self-defense, human rights, instead of concrete claims that could be interrogated. They issue carefully calibrated statements that leave open several possible interpretations. They cultivate the luxury of later saying, "I didn't mean it that way," should one of their many audiences demand clarification. This is profoundly dangerous because the stakes are world historical. The security of a democratic state, the suffering of an oppressed people, the legitimacy of Western moral judgment, the future of pluralistic societies where Jews and Muslims must live together, the meaning of international law, the limits of self-defense, the prospects of endless war. It is impossible to deliberate about such matters if citizens feel that deviating from their group's line will cost them social standing, career opportunities, or personal safety. A campus cannot be a place of learning if its intellectual climate is governed by fear. And let me be explicit, this is not about left versus right. Self-censorship operates everywhere. Jewish students fear being ostracized. Muslim and Arab students fear being surveilled or misunderstood. Professors police themselves to avoid triggering administrative investigations or online mobs. Journalists trim their prose to keep their reputations intact. The result is a tragic flattening of moral complexity. We lose the capacity to see that two things can be true at once: that Israel is a legitimate state with legitimate security needs, and that Palestinians endure an intolerable political reality that demands remedy. But nuance is not rewarded in a reputational economy driven by moral maximalism. And so the discursive equilibrium becomes brittle. We lose the ability to think, to mourn, to reason, to imagine a future. We perform our identities instead. And when identity performance takes the place of moral reasoning, even our gestures of compassion become suspect, interpreted as coded endorsements of one side or veiled hostility toward the other. The tragedy is that this performative climate makes it nearly impossible to articulate a politics of shared humanity. We forfeit the very imaginative resources we need to envision a just peace because we're too busy policing one another's symbolic posture. A healthier conversation about Gaza would begin by granting the full humanity of everyone involved. It would acknowledge Israeli fears without caricature and Palestinian suffering without euphemism. It would allow us to say plainly and without accusation that Israelis have legitimate security needs and that Palestinians deserve political dignity, freedom, and movement, freedom of movement, and a horizon of self-determination. It would invite us to ask hard questions about occupation, about terrorism, about borders, about law, about the future of two peoples in one land, without assuming that every question smuggles in hidden loyalties. In such a conversation, disagreement would not be a referendum on moral worth, and empathy would not be treated as betrayal. We could imagine practical steps: ceasefires, power-sharing arrangements, international guarantees, economic reconstruction, because we had first succeeded in imagining one another not as symbols, but as human beings. Let me conclude by talking about why this matters and what you must do. Why does it matter so much whether people feel comfortable saying everything they think? Because self-censorship is not simply a personal inhibition, it's a collective epistemic failure. A society that cannot openly deliberate cannot govern itself effectively. A democracy that cannot articulate its disagreements cannot resolve them. A community that punishes honest inquiry cannot cultivate wisdom. And a world that cannot deliberate soberly in the face of raging conflicts cannot hope to establish, much less enforce, the international norms that make coexistence among nations possible. When people hide behind ambiguity, when they speak in half-truths designed for diverse audiences, they also deprive themselves of the moral clarity necessary for responsible citizenship. A culture of plausible deniability is a culture where no one can be held accountable for what they actually believe, because no one ever fully says it. The health of a free society depends on a culture of intellectual courage, the willingness not only to criticize others, but also to face the possibility of being wrong, and even the possibility of being condemned for being right. So here's my charge to you, students and citizens. Do not treat your identity as an argument. Who you are does not determine what is true. And no durable understanding can emerge from the view that one's social location settles a question before the conversation even begins. And when you encounter intellectual honesty in others, even when their conclusions trouble you, even when affirming their good faith costs you something socially, reward it. That willingness to recognize sincerity across political or moral divides is the only way we shift the equilibrium toward a more truthful public life. Learn also to distinguish between offense and argument. Being disturbed is not an injury. It is part of the process by which minds expand and moral horizons widen. If you expect a university or a democracy to shield you from disquiet, you misunderstand the nature of both. Recognize as well that the freedom you claim for yourself cannot be sustained unless your ideological adversaries enjoy the same freedom. A system in which only our side may speak is not a system of liberty, it's a system of factional domination. And finally, insist on complexity. The world is not tidy, and simple narratives, however comforting, do not advance understanding. Reject the false choice between silence and extremism. There's a third way: to speak with clarity, humility, and moral seriousness, even when the world around you demands slogans. That is the path to an honest discourse and ultimately to a healthier civic life. Self-censorship is a quiet thing. It leaves no trail. It creates no martyrs, but it hollows out our intellectual life from within. It transforms universities from arenas of inquiry into theaters of moral performance. It converts democratic deliberation into ritualized hostility. And when our society fragments into multiple mutually distrustful audiences, and when every statement is crafted to maintain plausible deniability before all of them, our collective discourses become shallow, evasive, and more morally confused. We cannot build a common world on a foundation of strategic vagueness. We can do better. You can do better. How then are the demagogues and the haters to be denounced? How can reason gain a voice in the forum? How can the truth about our nation, our party, our race, our church come to light when the social forces of conformity and the rhetorical conventions of banality hold sway? How can we have a genuine moral discourse about ambiguous and difficult matters when the security and comfort of the platitudes lies so readily at hand? These things can be achieved only when people, first a few and then many, act not as utilitarian calculators, but rather as fully human and fully moral agents determined at whatever cost to speak such truths as they may have been given to know. So let us aspire to a public discourse worthy of a free people, one in which truth is pursued without fear, disagreement is offered without malice, and identity is never used as a cudgel to silence thought. Thank you. Thanks for your patience in hearing me out.
We will now start the Q&A. So if you have a question. Yes, so you can line up here or on this side.
Dr. Loury, so many of students nowadays participate, and adults too, in social media. And it seems that that's a launching pad for many careers. You gain followers, you get people to support your work through social media and to know who you are through social media. And social media doesn't seem to respond or reward, it depends. It rewards moral clarity, moral certainty, staking your claim on those things. So I'm curious how you would advise students or adults or faculty, how should they embody what you're saying on social media, not just in their daily lives?
That's a good question. I wish I had something useful to say about it. Rationing the amount of time you spend on social media is going to be fall on deaf ears, I'm sure. So I see a problem. I don't see already a solution at hand. This is a major transformation of our communication technology. and you get anonymity, and you get crowd effects, and so on. I actually don't know what to advise. They tell me I keep a podcast, there's a Substack, there's YouTube comments. They say, don't read the comments. And I can't not read the comments. And what I can do, however, is not to let myself be driven by the comments, but that requires enormous discipline and, audience capture, and you're worried about subscribers not resubscribing and stuff like that. You want to answer, but you can't answer them all, and, so I'm confessing my personal experience of the phenomenon that you're calling attention to. But I don't have the ready solution. Sorry.
Good evening, and thanks for coming, Professor, to the free state of Florida. I've got a question for you, because I think you've made an argument that seems really lazy to me, that you've talked about self-censorship, and you right away said that you were going to essentially ignore government censorship. And so if I was to stand up here and say, I think America's better off because Charlie Kirk is dead, I truly feel that, and I'd be happy to have that conversation, but I would wager that some of the faculty in this place could not say that without fear of their jobs, and the students couldn't say what they thought about Israel or Gaza without fear of possibly being deported or being academically suspended. And so I don't think self-censorship starts from within. I think it starts from the government and those kind of policies. So how do you address that, is my question to you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but the question of the First Amendment certainly comes up. I said I was going to focus on self-censorship. I didn't mean to say that there was no issue of the state. I just meant to say that was not the subject of my lecture. They interact, don't they? And it's a political issue, isn't it? So the courts should weigh in, shouldn't they? I don't favor the position, I'm glad Charlie Kirk is dead, but you should be able to say that without the police coming around to arrest you. I think that's clearly protected speech. You can't say it without people hearing you say it, though. And once they've heard that, they're going to form their judgments about you. Some of those people may be your employer. They may be people that you were going to be doing business with, but no longer want to do business with you because they heard you say that. That's not prohibited by any statutory or constitutional prohibition. So all the more reason to attend to the informal social sanction concerns that I'm involved with in this essay. But I grant that I'm going to deport you if you're here on a visa on the pretense that you misrepresented your application by not telling me that you were a pro-Hamas person. Again, I say I'm not a lawyer. I don't know about the legal standing. It may be that the courts will eventually speak, but that's a pretty troubling and very powerful use of the discretion of the authorities. So I hope I'm addressing your question, but that's what I think to say.
Hi, Dr. Loury. Sorry. Hi. I noticed in your talk, in your model, you didn't talk about how individuals without filters are impacted in your model. Do you have any more on that? Do you have anything to say on that?
I'm sorry, will you repeat it? I didn't hear you.
how individuals without filters, so someone that can't censor,
How individuals,
who physically can't censor themselves, how are they affected?
who have whatever a condition is that prohibits them from being able to modulate.
Yes.
Well, they have a disability in some social, psychological sense, and accommodation should be made, should it not?
But is your model, never mind. I'm thinking, how are they impacted in the society in your model?
I could speculate. My guess is that a person who, for example, I just make this up, lapses into vulgar profanity when they get emotionally excited without restraint and can't prevent themselves from doing so. Uses words that you don't spell out when you write them down because they are offensive to people.
Yeah.
Who spouts out racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, anti-Semitic expression in the middle of an argument when they get angry, not because they intend to offend, but because they can't govern the mental processes and the expressive processes that are on display when they do that. That person's in a tough position socially. All I'm doing is stating the obvious when I say that. I think a kind of, if you're aware of the fact that a person is so impeded in restraint, an allowance could be made, but people are going to be offended, and that person's going to have a pretty tough way to go in life.
I see. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Hey, Glenn, I've been a fan for years. It's great to see you up close in person. Thanks for coming. You've previously, or have often, and I've written about and warned about the dangers of moral overreaction or moral panic. How powerful imagery, like during the George Floyd moment, can drive judgment faster than the context and lead to really bad policies.
Yeah.
Now, I also note that you've signed the Brown University letter calling for a halt to Israel's war in Gaza, which I should note was dated November 7th, 2023, a month after the Hamas attack.
Yeah.
And it didn't make its appeal conditional on the release of hostages. Israel just got to do it. Hostages be damned. They'll be left behind, and maybe Hamas will be nice and give them up.
Well, the letter didn't say that, but that was the implication.
That was the implication. I'm sorry if I'm spelling out the implication.
No, it's all good.
Okay, so here's the question. Now, so in light of your recent comments about moral theater, and that letter was written at a time where, the term genocide was really shooting upwards. I did a content analysis, and the pairing of Israel and genocide has surpassed any other pairing ever, or at least since the newspaper data that we have is available. So my question is in light of your recent comments and your prior discussion about these phenomenon, moral reaction and need to respond before even all the facts or the context is known, do you worry that this kind of unconditional moral language may be experiencing the same kind of concept creep you've described, where moral expression becomes distortion and even unintentionally helps advance the names of terrorist groups that want you to feel that way as well?
Touche. I have a dear friend. I'm not going to name him. He's Jewish. He's roughly my age. He's also retired from Brown. He wrote me the most impassioned, caring rebuke when he saw my name amidst those signatories. And we had a dialogue about it. He was right that I should have kept my powder dry. And that I overlooked the important fact that there was no mention of the hostages in that letter. I'm prepared to say here to you and to everybody else who can hear me, that that was a mistake on my part, a mistake of judgment that, as you suggest, exemplified the very flaws that I'm trying to identify in this lecture of moral posturing. And I apologize for it.
For what it's worth, I mean, I wasn't upset. I was just, well, my father was really upset.
No,
about
you brought it up.
I'm asking this question for him.
You brought it up. It's not the first time, and it won't be the last time, I fear, because the internet is forever. But it was a mistake on my part. I mean, that's not to say that I didn't have concerns about that have been borne out subsequently about the carnage that was going to ensue in Gaza, and there are legitimate arguments that one could make about that. But I shouldn't have signed that letter.
I love you, Glenn. Thanks for coming.
Hi. I was just wondering, so when you talk about catering your message, if you're speaking specifically to like several different groups at one time in order to protect your association with those groups, and then you mentioned, you know, in your part where you're talking about the solution being more specific and being willing to say the things that might and probably will offend some people. I guess my question is, with how important identities and groups obviously are to us as people, do you think that the correct course of action, once you speak your mind in this specific manner and acknowledge the complexities, inevitably people will get offended? Do you think that you should then try to explain why you're doing it and explain why you're talking about the complexities and being very specific? Or is that something that you think you just have to be willing to speak on and allow people to take it as they might? Like, do you think that you have a responsibility to try and help them see why you're doing it? Or do you just kind of have to be willing to accept those consequences?
Yeah, I think you have, if you're concerned about the maintenance of the relationship with the person to whom you're speaking, who you know is going to be disturbed by your evocation of complexities or facts that are unpleasant or that are contrary to the narrative that the person you're speaking to most cherishes. If you value that relationship, you know, it's a little bit like in a personal relationship, in a marriage or a friendship, when a person has a flaw and you think it needs their attention, and how do you bring that to them, and how do you couch what you have to say about their drinking or about the way they talk to their spouse or about how they're irresponsible in their finances or you know, whatever. You couch your hard truth in a framework that vouchsafes the concern you have about the relationship. You don't want the relationship to end. Or if I'm speaking to an audience of African Americans and I want to talk about the Black family, and if I think that fatherlessness is an issue, and if I think that issue is implicated in communal violence, and I want to go down that road and talk about how kids get raised, how boys get disciplined, about the absence of fathers, about the nature of social life, I don't just pull out the statistical abstract and start reading off the table as if I'm wagging my finger in their faces and I'm pointing at them. I'm saying, you people, you look how you live, look what you do. I preface what I'm saying by saying, look, I'm concerned about the well-being of the community. I'm aware of the historical dynamics that are at play here. I know that there are complicated interrelationships between economy, polity, sociology, and so on like that. Nevertheless, here I want you to think about this. Let's think about it together. You know, that's just prudence, it seems to me, and a way of conveying mutual regard. You know, it doesn't matter what you know if I don't know that you care. You know, if you want to tell me a fact, but I feel like it's a weapon, it's a weaponized fact that you're using in order to score points against me without a concern about my well-being, I'm going to be less willing to hear that fact. And so the whole exchange will not do what I want it to do, which is to further the search for truth. It'll be to sunder the relationships and to have people go to their respective corners. So yeah, I think there's a responsibility. I'm not sure it's a moral responsibility. Maybe it's a prudential. At the end of the day, I want this to be a constructive exchange, not a relationship ending exchange concern. But yeah, I think there is a responsibility to do that. You're welcome, Molly.
Thank you for coming. So early in your speech, and I forget your exact wording, you mentioned one that you weren't talking about hateful speech, and later you also mentioned combating extremism. Would you draw a line between speech that you don't want to be self-censored and this type of speech? Because wouldn't, at least in my opinion, wouldn't that allow essentially all speech to be eventually censored if you just redefine the definitions?
What
of
are the
these
two
things?
types of speech now?
Well, you just mentioned hateful speech.
Hateful speech.
Earlier in your lecture, your talk.
Like someone who is clearly saying something that is racist, someone who uses the N-word, or what did I hear Nick Fuentes say not long ago? White men should run everything. Women belong in the kitchen. Blacks, most of them should be in jail. I don't forget what he had to say about Jews, but it wasn't friendly. Is that the kind of speech that you're asking me to make a distinction between that and constructive, critical truth-telling?
So I wasn't asking you to make a distinction, and to be clear, I disagree with all that. I was just asking you your opinion on if there is a line, because I just heard you mention hateful speech, and you also mentioned like combating extremism. So I was just curious if you drew that line.
I think there's a line. I hinted at that in a passage in the speech where I say that if you don't allow people to express legitimate contrarian opinion, contrary to orthodoxy, they retreat into online echo chambers where they relish transgression for its own sake, or words to that effect. I think transgression for its own sake is not what I'm advocating for when I say I'm against self-censorship. I think censoring myself from engaging in clearly hateful, I mean, now we have to get down to a definition of what do I mean by hateful. Pointing out the out-of-wedlock birth rate in a community is not hateful speech. Pointing out the crime rate in a community is not hateful speech. Saying, I don't want to live next to those NIGGERS because they're all criminals is hateful speech. I think we can make that distinction. And I have nothing good to say about the latter, which is not meant to further argument. It's invective. It's meant to offend. And, you know, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, so to be clear, I disagree with all those, very much so. I was just curious if you favored, say, restrictions on that kind of speech. I think I
do not favor restrictions on that kind of speech. I mean, if by that you mean legal restrictions, no. I favor social opprobrium. Yeah, I favor not inviting that guy to dinner.
Okay. I was just curious your opinion on that. Thank you so much.
Okay.
To be clear, I do not agree with any of that either. I'm
not putting it on you. No, don't worry.
No, I'm just clarifying that I'm asking because I'm interested in your opinion on these social dynamics.
No, it's a good question. It is, you know, Loury says, speak your truth as you're given to know it. Suppose people think your truth as you're given to know it is hate speech, and it could fit into the race category, it could fit into the Israel-Gaza category. Then what do? And I'm saying, without being very precise, there's a difference between a disagreeable argument. I think 1948 was a disaster for the Palestinian people. I think that the Israeli state is dominating for 3/4 of a century of people who deserve political freedom. A lot of people would regard that as disagreeable. It's not hate speech. I think the Jews have too much power.
Thank you.
That's over the line.
Thank you.
And this will be our last question.
It's like pornography. You know it when you see it, you know.
Hi, I do forgive me, this might be a little redundant, but I was curious. Earlier you mentioned that we should encourage people to speak their mind and have these conversations. But in the case like he said over there with like hateful rhetoric, like let's say like someone that's a genuine Nazi, like a coworker of mine, comes up and wants to have an honest discussion about his beliefs. Should I encourage him to be able to freely speak about those? Or is it like my responsibility, our responsibility to push back that kind of speech? Or does that prevent like that free speech from happening?
Okay, these are similar questions. I think I'm going to stick by my formula previously introduced, which is that you want the relationship to be discursively productive. You want to say to somebody, look, man, I get it that you're angry, but if you go around talking like that, no one's going to hear a word that you have to say about anything substantive because they're going to be offended by what you're saying. Trim your sail a little bit in the interest of maintaining people's attention long enough to be able to get your point across, something like that. Did you have a specific example in mind?
No, I was just wondering, should we encourage people, how do you encourage someone to be able to speak their mind without endorsing what they say? So like, for example, in the example of my Nazi coworker, how do I encourage him, hey, I want you to be able to have free speech, to speak what you believe without endorsing, I agree with, or like pushing him up?
Just don't endorse it. I have a podcast. I have people who come on. I had Charles Murray come on the podcast on more than one occasion, the writer whose book, The Bell Curve, was very controversial 30 years ago. Published the same year as my essay on self-censorship, as it happens. I've had Amy Wax, the professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, who has a lot of controversial things to say, come on my show and say the things that she has as a controversial to say. I don't agree with those things necessarily, but I listen, I hear them out, and then I push back in a respectful way or raise questions about it or probe the issue. But I think people who have unpleasant things to say, they don't have to be right. Proving them wrong is productive. If they don't say what they think that turns out to be wrong, we don't get the opportunity to interrogate what they think and demonstrate its error. So I'm in favor of allowing the contrarian to speak. Now, if it's a bomb thrower, if it's somebody, and this is my read of Nick Fuentes, I could be wrong about that, who just is being transgressive for the sake of performative shock. I don't feel like I need to platform that, and I don't feel like I need to listen to it. He does have a right to say what he's saying by law, but he doesn't have a right to my attention.
And that was actually going to answer my next question is, do you think by giving the floor, it like increases attention? But like you said, if they're just there for the attention, don't give them the attention. So thank you.
Was that a question?
It was a question, but you answered it before I could ask it. So
Okay.
So thank you.
You guys have been very attentive. I appreciate it. So thank you for coming out and hearing me out.